Hello and welcome to Book Club. We are continuing to read High Conflict by Amanda Ripley. And we are on chapter 3, The Fire Starters, page 111 of whatever edition this is, or rather 110. And yeah, we're maybe like 10 or 12 pages into chapter 3. And we are starting with the section that is titled, You're Not Latino, Man, which is certainly a way to start a section. In past sessions, we have talked about, just to do a little mini refresher up top here, we've talked about the illusion of communication, how people in an argument think that they have communicated the thing that they're upset about and why, and very often that has not actually happened, and the person that they're talking to does not know why they're upset or assumes that they know why they're upset and is wrong. Um, we have talked about, let's see, understanding versus agreement, right? That you can understand something without agreeing with it. You can understand someone without agreeing with them. And also that it takes practice to get there. And we have talked about the tar pits and how you can get stuck in high conflict, in the tar pits of high conflict, very, very easily. And now we are looking at what does it take to get out of the tar pits? And we were talking about Curtis, who at this point in our story is a youth growing up in Chicago in like the 80s. Um, and he just found out that the kid who's like the superstar basketball player is in the same gang that he is in. And he's like, oh my God, we're twins for real. All right. Quote, You're not Latino, man. The first time Curtis joined a gang, he joined the wrong one by mistake. He was 9 years old. He was getting picked on because he was light skinned and because his grandmother could afford to buy him an Atari. He was the oldest of three siblings, born to a 16-year-old single mom, and he had no big brother or father around to protect him or give him advice. Kids, kids kept saying he looked Latino because of his light skin, and he wasn't totally sure what Latino meant. But he knew Latinos joined the Latin Kings, and so he went where he thought he belonged. The gang initiation happened one day after school. The other Latin Kings handcuffed Curtis to a small tree and beat him up. Mostly they took body shots, but one punch hit him in the mouth. After that, Curtis was told he had to fight his friend Steve, who was also trying to join the gang. Then both boys had to fight some other guys. They got accepted, and Curtis felt proud, like he was someone. The feeling didn't last long. What the hell is that? You, a Latin king? You crazy, his cousins said. They laughed and laughed. You're not Latino, man. That was embarrassing. He'd wanted to belong, and instead, he felt humiliated. This group was not his group after all. He looked for another option, and he found, not too long afterward, the Vice Lords. He had relatives in that gang, he'd been told. That much he knew. Maybe this was his group. One day, after Curtis became a Vice Lord, he got on his bike and headed to a play rehearsal at the YMCA on the west side. He was about 10 years old, playing the role of a pirate, and so he biked through the city wearing a pirate hat in black and gold, the colors of the Vice Lords. He was loud and proud and hard to miss. A group of stones saw him, beat him up, and took his bike, one of the nicest bikes he'd ever had. It was the first time he ever got jumped on the streets of Chicago. It was a lesson. Curtis understood then that he was being watched. Signals were being sent out and received. That was just the way it worked. It wasn't personal. And like, side note here, right? I grew up in LA. I grew up in Southern California. I grew up specifically in the San Fernando Valley, which does have some gang activity, but is not quite LA the way that you would think of LA if you have never lived in LA. And so, like, even though there was not a ton of gang activity in the like suburbs that I mostly hung out in, like I still knew blue and red were off limits. Like you don't there are some neighborhoods you don't wear blue in, there are some neighborhoods you don't wear red in. If you are going somewhere that you don't know about the neighborhood, you avoid those colors because those are the gang colors for the Crips and the Bloods, which were way more like prevalent in Inglewood, which is south of where I lived, but like close enough that there was definitely still gang associations. And like I was in elementary school, I think, when I first learned like this is just something that you have to know about. This is just something you have to do if you're going to live here. And like it wasn't personal. It never felt personal. It was very clear that it wasn't personal. But like it is what it is, you know? A year later, when his family moved to Foster Park, Curtis did not hesitate to join the Stones himself. He wanted to match the other kids in the neighborhood. He wanted to belong, so he needed a new group. It didn't matter that they'd beaten him up the year before. Here's the tricky thing about groups: they can ignite conflict, but they can also extinguish it. This is the second paradox of conflict. Groups bring obligations, including the duty to do harm, or, in other groups at other times, the obligation to do no harm, to make peace. When people find a way in and out of violent conflicts, there is almost always a group at work in the background. Everything depends on the group's norms and traditions. What is the right way to deal with conflict? What constitutes an affront? When is it time to turn the other cheek? The way the brain evaluates the meaning of pain or threats depends, in part, on the group's leaders. Conflict entrepreneurs. As sisters go, Trisha and Julie Nixon were inseparable. They were maids of honor in each other's weddings. They remained close when their father became the first U.S. president to resign from office after the Watergate scandal. They smile or wave or cry together in 1,000 pictures, journalist Margaret Carlson wrote, standing by their father and each other. Then, in 1997, 3 years after their father's death, 25 years after Watergate, the sisters fell into high conflict. They could not agree on how their father's library should be run, whether it should be managed primarily by the family or by outsiders. We all know stories about estranged siblings. After their mother's funeral, actress sisters Joan Fontaine and Olivia de Havilland stopped speaking to one another. They were still estranged 38 years later when Fontaine passed away. In Germany, brothers Adolf and Rudolf Dassler, imagine being brothers named Adolf and Rudolf. This is Adolf and this is Rudolf. I could not take them seriously. Sorry. In Germany, brothers Adolf and Rudolf Dassler founded a sportswear company together, but then split up over a perceived slight. Adidas and Puma, the resulting companies, remain competitors today. Fucking bonkers. In fact, the loving ideal that we think of when we talk about brothers and sisters turns out to be relatively rare. Only about a third of American adults report having a close, supportive relationship with a sibling. Another third have either a hostile or competitive relationship. The rest are generally apathetic about their sibling, or have fond feelings but rarely speak. I do wonder. I do wonder how much of that has to do with high conflict and how much of that has to do with like American hyper individuality, exceptionalism, like that kind of stuff. Because it is, I don't know, some about this one just does not quite sit right with me, but we'll continue. Siblings represent the longest relationships most of us will ever have. Our parents exist in our lives for about 50 years if we're lucky, but our siblings can be with us 70 to 80 years. That's a lot of time for misunderstandings, mistreatment, and resentment to build. All sibling relationships start in conflict as children competing for our parents' attention, and the crockpots accumulate. It's like a political campaign that lasts a lifetime. Meanwhile, parents and other friends and family can sway the conflict dynamics. They can make sibling conflicts less toxic. But sometimes they do the opposite. They add to the paranoia and hostility, seeding doubts and whispering rumors. These people are what we'll call conflict entrepreneurs, our second fire starter after group identities. So, first fire starter is group identities, which we talked about with like competing gangs and stuff, right? And also that it's possible for a group identity to pull you out of high conflict. And then the second fire starter is conflict entrepreneurs, which like again, I don't know that I love the example of siblings being specifically used here. I don't know if it makes the most effective point. Um, but like I don't think she's wrong. Let's keep going. In the Nixon sister feud, family members and library employees took sides. Lawyers got involved. The library's director was accused of fanning the fire. He's done what all the Nixon haters couldn't do, drive a wedge in the family, a library board member said. Angry letters got leaked. Two lawsuits were filed. A $20 million bequest to the library sat unused because the sisters could not agree. There is a complete estrangement between the sisters, a library employee said. It was a classic high conflict. Everyone was worse off except for the lawyers. I think it is very sad, Julie said 5 years after the dispute had begun. It's very heartbreaking because I love my sister very much. No matter how much she wanted to end the conflict, it kept grinding on. And it might have continued until one of them died. Many sibling conflicts do. Then one person interrupted the spiral. A judge ordered the sisters to resolve the conflict. There is going to be a party, said the judge, and everybody's going to come. That does sound like a decom, like a Disney Channel original movie, a little bit. Like, you have been ordered by the judge to throw a party and be friends again. On a warm summer day in 2002, the sisters met behind closed doors at the Intercontinental, a luxury hotel on Biscayne Bay in downtown Miami. Two off duty police officers kept guard outside the conference room. A mediator appointed by the court was there, sworn to silence, along with a gaggle of lawyers. At one point, the sisters broke away from the group and went off by themselves to talk. Just before 2 in the morning, they reached an agreement. A conflict that had lasted 5 years was resolved in less than 24 hours. The final agreement was only 2 pages long. Once the conflict entrepreneurs got sidelined, it appeared, the sisters were free at last. The conflict became healthy. The women shared an emotional hug outside of the conference room. Julie and I have always loved each other for more than 50 years, Tricia said, and we always will. Yeah, okay. One way to prevent high conflict is to learn to recognize the conflict entrepreneurs in your orbit. Notice who delights in each new plot twist of a feud, who is quick to validate every lament and to articulate wrongs no one else has even thought of. We all know people like this, and it's important to keep them at a safe distance. In practice, this can be hard to do, especially for people trapped in the conflict themselves, because conflict entrepreneurs are often very important in people's lives. They can be loving, persuasive, and charismatic. The best ones make themselves essential. They become central to a group's identity, and without them, it's harder to feel like there's an us. Big fucking oof. Enormous oof. Um, yeah, it's I'll be real. The first time I read this, that section there made me check myself a little bit because I love the tea. I love to gossip. I love to know everybody's business. I love to know what's going on in the neighborhood, who's fighting with who, what are we fighting about? And like, I do think that there is a very vital social role that gossip plays and that like spilling the tea plays. But there is like a tendency of mine that I have had to step on, which is like wanting to make the person who's complaining to me feel like they're being heard, right? And how do you do that? Well, you like contribute to the conversation. You say, "Yeah, they shouldn't have treated you like that. Yeah, you are right to be upset." And actually, maybe that is not the best response when somebody is giving me the tea. And so I have like I still ask for it. Like, I'll be real. I still want to know everything that's going on with everybody all the time. But I am way less prone to fanning the flames of those particular fires than I used to be. And it's still something that I like catch myself at sometimes. All right. Next section. There's a fine balance. Yeah, exactly. It's a fine balance. I will never be somebody who's like, no, gossiping is evil and bad. Like, no, it's there's like a real important social role for it. But also just like pump the brakes, be a little bit wary. Don't just immediately go like, yeah, you're a reliable narrator. You're definitely giving me the entire story, you know? All right, next section. Stone love. The Stones were an especially powerful group because of their leader. The group had been co-founded in the 1960s by a larger-than-life young man named Jeff Fort, who called out racial injustice across the country. Fort wielded his charisma in unusual ways. He advised local politicians on how to combat poverty, and he got invited to President Nixon's inauguration. When Curtis was growing up, Fort's reputation in the community was legendary. When he and his entourage walked by an elementary school playground, kids would swarm the fence to get a look at him. Fort preached the values of Islam and Black power and gave young black men a literal space to come together, in a building the Stones bought on South Drexel Avenue. By the 1980s, Fort had created a new gang called the El Rukns, Rukns. Apologies if I pronounced that incorrectly, which Curtis would also join. To avoid confusion, I will keep referring to the organization as the Stones, as Curtis generally does today. The temple, as it was called, had a steel door with 3 bolted locks. It served as a disco, a weapons arsenal, and on Fridays, a mosque. Fort moved around the city in a chauffeured Cadillac limousine escorted by bodyguards. He wore dark sunglasses even in the courtroom. He had a throne, an actual throne, inside the temple, or so it was said. He handed out new shoes to kids who needed them. To a boy like Curtis, Fort was power. From the beginning, Fort understood how much boys and men in Chicago wanted to belong to something bigger than themselves. That's what made him such a good fire starter. He intuitively understood the psychology of conflict. He made t shirts for all the Stones to wear and came up with a list of sacred Stones values: love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. There was a special Stones handshake, a special Stones way of wearing your hat and your belt buckle, a Stones way of being. When younger boys wanted to join the gang, they had to get parental permission. Fort pushed gang members to finish high school and shun drugs and alcohol. But the Stones were simultaneously operating one of the more successful dope rings in Chicago. By the early 1980s, you couldn't sell uppers and downers or even weed on the South Side without getting the okay from the Stones and sharing your profits. The Stones were rumored to have branches in Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and Columbus, Ohio. Curtis wanted to be part of it all. So in middle school, he forged a letter from his mother and joined the Stones. Imagine, yeah, my mom totally signed the permission slip for me to join your gang. Crazy work. His friend Jesse became a Stone too. Because of all the gymnastics he'd done, Jesse was strong. He became known for his ability to handle himself with his hands. If Curtis got in trouble with a rival gang, Jesse would appear and start throwing people off of him. And Curtis would do the same for Jesse and other fellow Stones. For Curtis, it felt like he'd found his people, finally. Each day, he turned his hat to the left, and he knew he was not alone. I suspect things are about to get bad for our friend Curtis. Part real, part lies. In the beginning, groups get created in order to solve a problem for someone. That means they can be based on ethnicity, religion, shared kin, or whatever works as a glue to bring people together. The nature of the group can change as the nature of the problem changes. Decades can go by in relative peace, and then something happens, usually a dispute over land, money, or politics, and new life is injected into old grievances. Groups are part real, part lies. And the worse the conflict gets, the bigger the lies get. In Syria, about 500,000 people have been killed in the recent civil war, which is viewed as a devastating ethnic and sectarian conflict. But it was not, when it began, about group divisions at all. It was about graffiti. In March 2011, in a quiet border town named Daraa, a group of teenage boys spray painted the words freedom and "It's your turn, doctor" on the wall of a high school, implying that Syrian President Bashar al Assad, a dictator who was trained as an ophthalmologist, would be the next ruler to fall during the Arab Spring upheavals that had spread against Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. In response, Assad's security forces arrested the boys and refused to tell their parents where they were. The teenagers were beaten and tortured for weeks. When the locals protested, security forces fired at crowds, killing several people. The protests spread to other cities. The regime brutally suppressed the uprisings with tanks and air power. In this spasm of violence, people began to retreat to groups for safety, awakening old, latent identities. It was a way to survive, physically and mentally. People needed a compass with which to navigate the carnage, and many grabbed the one most readily available to them. Syria is run largely by, I'm going to mispronounce this probably, Alawites, Alawites. I think Alawites. Or, no, I'm going to look this up. How to pronounce Alawite. Okay. Alawite. Alawite? Alawite? I don't think that's correct. Okay. Alawite. Okay, great. So, Syria is largely run by Alawites, a sect of Islam whose members include Assad, but they represent only 12% of the population. Meanwhile, Sunnis make up the majority of Syria but have little political power. As word of the regime's brutality spread, some Sunnis began to consider the ruling Alawites to be their enemy and attacked them. The Alawites, in turn, feared that they'd be massacred in Sunni revenge killings if Assad were overthrown. They were outnumbered, and so some started forming militias to protect themselves, which then confirmed the Sunnis' worst fears. As people, we don't want anything to happen to us. Nope. As people, we don't want anything to happen between us, a Sunni man named Mohammed told a reporter in 2011, just 3 months into the conflict, before anyone was calling it a civil war. But the people in this regime are forcing us to hate Alawites. Mohammed could feel the group conflict taking over, manipulated by Assad and other opportunistic leaders. Even as he felt pulled into it, he could see it for what it was. An old and dear Alawi, An old and dear Alawite friend of his texted him to ask if his family was okay. He told his friend of 25 years the truth, that two of his sisters had just been killed in a government crackdown in his town. Very quickly, latent identities came back to life in Syria, and the divisions deepened. It was a feedback loop of the most diabolical kind. The old religious and ethnic cinders, quiet for many generations, roared to life, fueled by conflict entrepreneurs. Ethnic wars do not just happen, political scientist Gary Bass wrote. They are made. Yeah, no kidding. Firestarter leaders seize the opportunities embedded in conflict and turn them to their advantage. Assad's regime needed Syrians and other global leaders to feel even more terrified of his opposition than of him, and so the regime intentionally helped the more radical elements among his opponents. They released extremist prisoners and even funneled weapons to protesters. It sounds crazy. Why would a dictator like Assad help the people trying to overthrow him? Because he understood fear. He knew that fear hardens group identities. He needed to make the conflict about fighting terrorists rather than about his own crimes against his own people. Well, now, isn't that interesting? Syria may feel far away to many people reading this book, but the more I learned about conflict, the more familiar these patterns started to feel. All over the world, fire starter leaders intentionally play on our identities. Okay, forgive me. She's got a whole sentence full of names that I'm going to struggle to pronounce. I am doing my best, I promise. Narendra Modi in India, Yaroslav Kaczynski in Poland, Donald Trump in the United States, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. They were all master fire starters. They intentionally stoked rival identities to boost their popularity and power, just like gang leaders, inciting contempt and turning neighbors on neighbors. Identity manipulation is very hard to resist, given our basic wiring as humans, but not impossible. To begin, it is important to be vigilant, to notice when one of our identities feels newly electrified, and to ask the question, who does this serve? Just as leaders can exploit our worst instincts, they can call us to our best selves. We each contain many versions of ourselves, which can be summoned or suppressed depending on the moment. Whoo, that's very, very heavy. I want to take a second because that was a very, very heavy little section and circle back to who does this serve? Because I think the most effective thing that I have consistently used when I feel myself sliding into high conflict or see other people like around me sliding into high conflict is genuinely asking, like, hey, who does this serve? Yeah, I can absolutely see that you're upset about this. Very valid. You're allowed to feel however you want to feel. Like, I'm not saying you shouldn't be upset, but I do want to ask. I do want to pause and ask who benefits from you being upset about this, right? Who benefits from you being upset about this instead of something else? Who benefits from you fighting this other guy instead of the billionaires? And like, it's you, what are you going to say, right? Like once you really get down to it and you go like, well, who does this serve? Like, who is benefiting from us continuing to fight about this dumb shit? Oh, it's the people in power. It's the people who have all the money. It's the people who run the companies. It's the people who, like, if we actually stopped fighting each other and like all turned to look at the billionaires and went like, hey now, that guillotine's looking really sharp, they'd be fucked. They'd be super fucked, and they know it. And so keeping us fighting is like survival for them, right? And then the other thing that I think is really interesting, and I think she talks about this more later. I think we're going to circle back to this, but groups get created in order to solve a problem for someone. And this has to do with like labels, this has to do with identity. There is a fight that happens in the queer community kind of like annually, right? About identities and like what identities are allowed to exist. Uh who's can trans men be lesbians? Can does bisexuality exist? Does asexuality exist? Can asexual people have sex? Like just all of these things that basically come down to, hey, you have forgotten that the reason groups exist, the reason labels exist is to solve a problem. And if the groups and the labels are now causing more problems, then perhaps it is time to change the label or change the group or broaden the definition or whatever. Um, yeah, I don't know. So it's not a fully formed thought, I don't think, but there's something there that is worth talking about. All right. Proof of hope. After that first sighting on the basketball courts of Foster Park, Curtis got the chance to see Benji play several more times. That's Big Ben, he'd say when he spotted the teenager's lanky frame prowling the courts. Sometimes he'd stand on the sidelines and just watch Benji shoot free throws, tracking the ball from Benji's hands to the net like the two were connected by a magnetic force. It was mesmerizing. When Curtis stared like this, Benji didn't run the younger boy off. He just took shot after shot after shot, like a man at work, his deep-set eyes locked on the task. In 1984, Benji led his team at Simeon Vocational High School to the state championship. Chicago's first black mayor, Harold Washington, came to the school on Vincennes Avenue to congratulate them. That March, Benji's name appeared in the Chicago Tribune no fewer than 20 times. He was a local celebrity on the cusp of going national. The paper even ran a front page story about Simeon High School, calling it a school of winners in the headline. This mattered to Curtis because his neighborhood was changing all around him. Redlining, the practice whereby banks refused loans to people in certain disproportionately black neighborhoods, had been officially outlawed, but it continued in less obvious ways. Curtis's neighbors were largely black and middle class, earning incomes at or above the citywide average, but they had a hard time getting loans to fix up their homes or buy new ones. Of the neighborhood's 121 buildings, over half were vacant. Crack hadn't made it to Chicago yet, but most kids knew an aunt or an uncle hooked on heroin or pills. The once bustling 79th Street commercial strip was becoming a marketplace for drugs, prostitution, and liquor stores. But then, undeniably, there was Benji Wilson. When he was on the court, Benji lit the place up, proof of hope in Foster Park. By the transitive property of the hood, Benji belonged to all the kids on the South Side, and especially to his fellow Stones. At recess, when 12-year-old Curtis charged up the court and took wild, impossible shots, in his mind, he was Benji Wilson too. The next school year, Sporting News magazine ranked Benji as the #1 high school basketball player in the country. Benji's team at Simeon High School was on track to win the state title once again. The more fame Benji got, the harder he seemed to work. If he'd put up 300 shots a day last year in Foster Park, he would do 400 a day this year. By November, he had narrowed down his top 3 college choices to the University of Illinois, DePaul University, and Indiana University. When he visited DePaul, Benji stood 18 feet from the basket and made 20 shots. He only missed 3. DePaul was ranked second in the country, but no one on their team could match him. Michael Jordan came to Chicago that fall to play for the Bulls. It was obvious right away that he was the best person on that team, and Curtis was excited for his hometown team. He hoped that Benji would play for the Bulls one day too, because Jordan was from North Carolina, which was all well and good. But Benji was a stone from the South Side. One day in November, right before Thanksgiving, Curtis was lying on the couch watching the nightly news with his grandfather like he always did. Then a story came on that made him sit up and listen. Earlier that day, in broad daylight, high school basketball star Benji Wilson had been shot twice, the announcer said. It had happened on Vincennes Avenue, near Benji's high school, while he was walking with his girlfriend on his lunch break. They done shot that boy? His grandfather said quietly. Curtis didn't answer. He was struggling to understand what he was hearing. The bullet had pierced Benji's liver and his aorta, whatever that was. Doctors were operating on him at that very moment. Kids were holding a vigil at the hospital. His condition was serious, they said, but Benji was 17 and he was strong. God willing, Curtis prayed, Benji would still be able to play ball. His first game of the season was scheduled for the next night. When the newscast ended, he and his grandfather watched the game that came on next, but Curtis couldn't stop thinking about the news. Imagine Benji Wilson getting shot, right on Vincennes Avenue, a place he'd walked by so many times. Benji Wilson! It seemed impossible. Benji had no enemies. Why would anyone want to hurt him? Benji died at 6 a.m. Curtis heard the news at Foster Park the next day. The air left his chest. Oh, we got a first-time chat from a bot. Goodbye. Now, where were we? Curtis heard the news at Foster Park the next day. The air left his chest. Pain took its place, the kind of pain that spreads through the body like acid, eating away at the inside. Plenty of people died, Curtis knew, even at 12 years old. Not just old people, but young people, caught up in the violence of the drug trade. But heroes didn't die. Not like this. In his head, thoughts began spiraling. Why did it have to be Benji? He was short of breath. Who else is there? We have nobody else. Guess what? A kid said. Billy and Omar killed him. Another punch in the chest. Billy and Omar? Curtis knew Billy and Omar. They lived around the corner. They were just regular kids, nobodies. The newspaper said that Billy Moore, 16, had fired a .22 caliber pistol at close range, with his friend Omar Dixon at his side. This was a random, senseless shooting, a police detective told the Chicago Tribune. It was just one of those things that happens in the streets. But Curtis did not accept random and senseless. On some level, below his awareness, he could not live with random and senseless. No, Billy had to have recognized Benji. He was the tallest kid in the neighborhood, famous, unmissable. Billy must have been jealous of Benji. That's what it was. Now what? Rumors snaked their way through Foster Park. Billy had gone after Benji, some folks said, because Benji's hat was to the left. Because Benji's hat was to the left. Where are they? Curtis begged. He knew the way to Billy's and Omar's houses, and he wanted to make someone feel the pain he was feeling. They'd taken a member of his family, snatched away a whole city's hope, and for what? Now he felt rage, the kind that pushes pain to the side. The funeral was held 2 days after Thanksgiving. In his casket, Benji was dressed in his blue and gold Simeon basketball uniform. Beside the casket was a flower arrangement in the shape of a basketball, adorned with Benji's number, 25. 10,000 people came, spilling onto the street. The speeches at the 3-hour ceremony were piped out to the mourners through speakers mounted on trucks. Mayor Washington spoke, his voice cracking as he promised a new push to end gang violence. The Reverend Jesse Jackson lamented the senselessness. A superstar is dead, shot down, unarmed, in cold blood. But Curtis wasn't at the funeral. He was busy trying to make things right. That weekend, Curtis stole his grandfather's .357 Magnum revolver and began a pursuit that would occupy him for years to come. The nuclear bomb of emotions. Have a little bit of water. One moment. All right. The nuclear bomb of emotions. Conflict can explode when social pain becomes unbearable, when it becomes something worse than exclusion, when it becomes humiliation. Humiliation is the nuclear bomb of the emotions, the psychologist and physician Evelyn Linder wrote. That's why it's the third fire starter following group identity and conflict entrepreneurs. Humiliation poses an existential threat that jeopardizes the deepest part of ourselves, our sense that we matter, that we are worth something. It is the enforced lowering of a person or group, Linder writes, a process of subjugation that damages or strips away their pride, honor, and dignity. People need to matter. It's a fundamental requirement for life, like oxygen. Our need to matter lies underneath all kinds of group conflict. When, like Curtis, we find ourselves in situations where revered members of our group can be snuffed out randomly, the obvious conclusion is that we don't matter either. That is crushing, like a loss of oxygen. Notice that Curtis's first thoughts on hearing about Benji's death were about his own place in the world. Who else is there? We have nobody else. Humiliation creates desperation. As Nelson Mandela once said, there is nobody more dangerous than one who has been humiliated, even when you humiliate him rightly. In interviews with more than 200 people involved in conflicts in Somalia and Rwanda, Lindner found that humiliation permeated their stories of victimization and persecution. Often these stories were told by the same people. Feelings of humiliation drive acts of humiliation, and on the cycle goes. Humiliation can become an obsession, she found, as significant and consuming as any form of addiction or dependence. And like, pause, think about it. Yeah, like anytime you listen to one of these like neo-Nazi D-bags that gets on the news, fucking alt-right loser, whatever, who are like, yeah, I hate trans people. Why do you hate trans people? Because a trans person rejected me publicly in front of my friend group, and so now it's my life's mission to like get rid of all trans people because one humiliated me one time. Like, so it can become an obsession. Which is why it is so surprising that humiliation gets ignored so much of the time. You rarely read about humiliation in history books or in news coverage of political conflict. In his travels around the world, New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman noticed this omission. If I've learned one thing covering world affairs, it's this. The single most underappreciated force in international relations is humiliation, he wrote. Most journalists pay far more attention to battle strategy or the pursuit of land, oil, or power. But to ignore humiliation is to miss a powerful understory, driving all manner of conflict. It afflicts prime ministers and generals just as much as it does guerrilla fighters and gang members. As a prison psychiatrist, James Gilligan conducted many interviews with men who had been convicted of serious crimes. He started to notice that humiliation was connected to violence like smoke to fire. I have yet to see a serious act of violence that was not provoked by the experience of feeling shamed and humiliated, disrespected and ridiculed, he wrote, and that did not represent the attempt to prevent or undo this loss of face. This cycle never ends for some people. There are people who thrive on humiliation, Linder wrote. They are addicted to feelings of humiliation, provoke them systematically, and perpetrate acts of humiliation to avenge the humiliation they feel they have suffered. Watch out for these people, Linder warned. If someone like this gets into a position of great power and taps into a reservoir of humiliation in a country, war and genocide can follow. Well, that's bone chilling. But what constitutes humiliation? This is a slippery question. During World War II, guards in concentration camps would order prisoners to make and remake their beds until they were perfect, Holocaust survivors told psychologist Nico Friedja. Male Holocaust survivors said they felt humiliated by this experience, but the female survivors did not feel humiliated. They interpreted it differently, another indignity among many. Either way, the guards were harassing the inmates, but whether it felt humiliating depended on a person's identity and concept of the world, what it means to be a man, to matter and not matter. Humiliation is not an objective matter, as it turns out. It is an emotion. Our culture and values shape how we interpret our emotions. This is not to say that humiliation is imaginary. The pain is real and excruciating. But one of the most startling revelations of modern science is that emotions and thoughts cannot be separated. They are intertwined. When we feel humiliated, it's because our brains have conducted a rapid fire evaluation of events and fit it into our understanding of the world. To be brought low, we have to first see ourselves as belonging up high. To take a trivial example, I've only been golfing once in my life. I don't care about golfing at all. If I swing the club with all my might and utterly miss the ball, as I did at least once, I feel a little foolish. I laugh at myself, but I don't feel humiliated because being good at golf is not part of my identity. If Tiger Woods did the same thing, it might feel humiliating, particularly if it was caught on camera. The greatest humiliations are the ones that feel public. During peace talks in 2004 in Northern Ireland, the IRA agreed to destroy its weapons. The opposition asked that the IRA take photographs, proving that they had done so. It was a matter of transparency, they said, that's all. The IRA's leaders refused. It was one step too far, this demand for photographs. The peace talks stalled. One man's transparency is I'll give you that again. One man's transparency is another's humiliation, said Jerry Adams, president of the political wing of the IRA. And if I could do an Irish accent, I would have done an Irish accent for that one, but I will not subject you to that. If humiliation is the nuclear bomb of conflict and humiliation is subjective, then it can be manipulated. It can be incited on purpose. This is a radical idea. Today, more than ever, perhaps, many people think about emotions as being reflexes triggered by events. That's where the concept of safe spaces comes from on many college campuses. The idea that people need to be protected from triggers that can set off emotions. And yet, a century of research has not been able to identify a universal physical pathway for emotion. There is no identifiable, consistent, and objective measure of anger, for example. Emotional experiences vary wildly from culture to culture in how and when they are understood and expressed. Emotions, in other words, are socially informed. We help create them. In this way, crushing humiliation is not like a loss of oxygen. It is partly a product of our mind and our experiences. Emotions are real in the same way that national identities are real, but they are not objective facts. No matter what, Curtis was going to experience pain on the day that Benji died. But consider the different ways in a parallel universe that Curtis might have interpreted that loss. Benji did not know Curtis's name, keep in mind. They were not friends. Curtis's day-to-day life did not need to change when Benji died. It's possible to imagine a scenario in which Curtis would have experienced deep sadness and even fear when Benji was killed, but not humiliation. At the time, in his only available reality, Curtis instantly felt Benji's death as a threat to the deepest part of himself, to his sense that he mattered. He felt a flood of emotion on Benji's behalf, and he wasn't alone. It was the flip side of the collective pride he and his friends felt when they saw Benji play basketball. This was collective humiliation, experienced by proxy when a hero gets stripped of his humanity. It was the forcible lowering of someone who was up high, and it was done right out in the open for everyone to see. And like parasocial relationships, right? That Curtis had a parasocial relationship with Benji even before the word parasocial existed. Curtis had a parasocial relationship with Benji, who is this like local town hero. And with social media and influencers and the rise of like the internet personality and like parasocial relationships hitting the mainstream and being like very acceptable in a lot of ways, and like this is such a fire starter, right? This is at least a big part of why Swifties and Barbies or Barbs and like BTS Army and all of the different fandoms, Voltron fandom, like all of these different things that us millennials and like Gen Z and Gen Alpha and whatever have experienced as like mob mentality, internet insanity, defending a celebrity comes from this because there's this identification with the celebrity. And like, if someone's talking shit about that celebrity that your identity is so based around, it's like they're talking shit about you. But like, it's subjective. It doesn't have to be that way. All right. Many forces and experiences shaped Curtis's interpretation of Benji's death. But one important part of his history was his experience with sudden violence. Ever since age 7 or so, Curtis had been witnessing brutality up close, not just against fellow gang members, but against his most intimate group, his family. Again and again, he'd see his mom get beaten up by her boyfriends, a whole series of them. He himself had been fondled by one of these men. One thing Curtis decided early on was that he wasn't going to let what happened to his mom happen to him. He wasn't going to be prey, as he put it. So he needed to be on constant alert to protect himself from such threats, which were hard to predict. His brain had to look for cues, warnings in the tiniest things. A cue could be the way someone looked at him, or the way a hat was tipped. The world was full of threats, and he had to be hyper vigilant. This is what chronic stress and trauma can do to people. Anything that reminds our brain of previous trauma is interpreted as a threat, even when it's not a threat. Conflict becomes extremely hard to avoid. Other things shaped Curtis's interpretation of Benji's death, too. Groups develop ways of looking at the world, default frames to help them understand what is happening. Leaders prioritize certain emotions over others. This is why certain languages have words for emotions that do not exist in other languages. For example, in Finland, the word sisu means a sort of inner fire, ferocity in the face of great odds. It's an important word, one that is cited for all kinds of Finnish accomplishments, from growing potatoes in frozen soil to building the best education system in the world today. But English has no word for sisu. In the 1960s, when the anthropologist Jean Briggs lived among the Utku, an Inuit group in the Arctic Circle, she noticed that they tended to reject anger. It just wasn't allowed, culturally speaking. Small children were allowed to get angry and throw tantrums, but after about age 6, people were expected to exhibit ihuma, a kind of deep self-control that produced outer calm or laughter instead of rage. People still got visibly angry, but not very often. In mini gangs, the culture is the opposite of the Utku. To be angry is to be strong. Any slight, being stared at or called a bitch or shoved, is seen as a potential threat, not just to a gang member's physical safety, but also to his masculinity, his sense of mattering in the world. Other emotions get suppressed, just like anger does among the Utku. There is no tolerance for fear, for example, especially in the face of disrespect. To do nothing in response is to be humiliated. So in gangs, humiliation can become a default frame, a way to instantly interpret any chaos and injustice in the world. From a young age, Curtis was literally surrounded by threats, perceived and real. He saw too much evidence that he did not matter. So Curtis found backup in the gang, and he learned to respond to anything that made him feel small or frightened with overwhelming force. Billy and Omar were arrested and held in jail almost immediately after the shooting. In response, Jesse Jackson and other leaders called for swifter prosecution of juveniles. If Benjamin Wilson spent Thanksgiving in the morgue, Jackson said, at Christmas the killer should be in the penitentiary. But prison did not feel anything close to justice, not to Curtis. He had to find a way to stop this pain. Billy and Omar were members of a rival gang, the Gangster Disciples, Curtis knew. Benji's death was personal, not random. They killed Benji because his hat was to the left, Curtis had heard people say. It made a kind of sense. And so it also made sense what he had to do next. A beloved brother Stone had been killed by a gangster disciple. If he couldn't get to Billy and Omar, other gangster disciples would suffice. Groups contain multitudes. I really didn't know anything about the disciples except that they wore opposite colors and wore their hats different, Curtis said. And then people start telling you stories about things that disciples have done to stones. In this way, the stones cultivated their hatred of the disciples. The disciples were ignorant and low class, the stones said. Dirty folks is how the stones referred to them. They were low and the stones were up high. It was embedded in our minds that we were better than the folks, Curtis said. There was always this thought of supremacy that we're better than, and I think that whenever that's in there, a better than, a less than, there's always room for war. If the disciples were using guns, he needed a gun too. He had to protect himself, and he had to seek revenge. Soon, he was shooting at disciples on Billy's block, boys he'd been moonwalking with just weeks before. He doesn't remember feeling any doubt. There was no space for doubt. What if Benji, whoop, what if Benji had been killed by a stone, not a disciple? That scenario was not hard to imagine. These things happened in the chaos of the streets. But it was difficult to imagine how he would have reacted. It would have hurt, I think, but in my mind, it would have probably been easier, right? He said, looking off into the distance. I think it would have been more introverted. It would have hurt inside. Probably something I would have held to myself, sat in a corner and cried. But I wonder. Back then, Curtis's friend Jesse reacted to Benji's death a little differently than Curtis. He joined the fight against the disciples some of the time, but not always. He had mixed feelings. Man, this gang shit is okay, but I'm trying to do something different, he'd say. Jesse was a go getter. He started selling hot dogs in the parking lot of a drugstore not far from Foster Park. It was a profitable business. Not long after Benji was killed, Jesse was found dead in that parking lot. He'd been beaten to death with a piece of wood with nails sticking out of it. Something in Curtis shifted when he saw Jesse in that open casket, wearing a wig, looking like a stranger because his head had been so damaged. It was hard to avoid the conclusion that Jesse's life didn't matter, which meant that Curtis's life didn't matter. Once again, Curtis suffered a sudden, devastating loss. And once again, he had an explanation, one that made a sick kind of sense. The drugstore was Disciples' territory, and everyone knew Jesse was a stone. They'd killed him for being a stone, just like they'd killed Benji. Curtis was at war. That's how it felt. Nothing less. Boys could be butchered at any moment for no good reason, without remorse, because of the group to which they belonged. And so, as the wrongs accumulated, the gang conflict became more and more necessary to Curtis. The group rivalry provided purpose and order, a coherence where there was none. Things didn't happen for no reason, even when they did. We all have this tendency to look for a narrative that makes sense of the world. This is why conspiracy theories take hold. This is why many people were convinced that 9/11 must have been a government conspiracy, that the mass shooting of 20 school children in Newtown, Connecticut must have been a hoax, just like COVID-19. There is a perverse comfort in these falsehoods. Conspiracy theories reassure us that life is not, after all, fragile and chaotic. No, in fact, powerful people are pulling the strings on purpose, and they must be stopped. After Jesse's death, Curtis evolved from being an ordinary gang member to a full-fledged gangbanger. He went from being a guy who carried the weapons to a guy who used the weapons. The wrongs piled up, and the lines of causality all seemed to lead back to the disciples. It felt like the only way, even when it wasn't. Oh, very, very heavy. Little sip of water, little deep breath. We continue. The telling. Quote, the enduring attraction of war is this. Even with its destruction and carnage, it can give us what we long for in life. It can give us purpose, meaning, a reason for living. Unquote. Chris Hedges, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. Group conflicts are about more than what people say they're about. They are fueled by emotions and biases that make things simple, too simple. In these ways, group conflicts resemble interpersonal conflicts like Gary's. But group conflicts can last much longer for two reasons. First, groups distribute the conflict, spreading it around. In Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a character named Buck describes a feud that has gripped his family for 3 decades. Well, says Buck, a feud is this way. A man has a quarrel with another man and kills him. Then that other man's brother kills him. Then the other brothers on both sides goes for one another. Then the cousins ship in. And by, everybody's killed off and there ain't no more feud. But it's kind of slow and it takes a long time. Which is like, yeah, man. You're so right, bestie. Fuck. Emotions are more contagious than any virus. You can catch them through stories without any human contact. And of all the emotions people experience in conflict, hatred is one of the hardest to work with. If humiliation is the nuclear bomb of emotions, hatred is the radioactive fallout. That's because hatred assumes the enemy is immutable. If the enemy will always be evil, there is no reason to ever consider any creative solutions to the conflict. The enemy will never change. In that sense, hatred is different from anger. Anger holds out the possibility of a better future. The underlying goal of anger is to correct the other person's behavior. The logical outcome of hate is to annihilate. Hatred prolongs and escalates conflict, and it can motivate people to commit massacres. Okay, content warning. We're going to be talking about the Israel Palestine conflict in the next paragraph. Here's what one participant told Israeli researcher Iran Halperin when describing her hatred toward Palestinians. Quote, "They will never change. They were born unfaithful and they will die this way. Even after 40 years in the grave, you shouldn't trust an Arab." Unquote. All right. Over time, humiliation and hatred accumulate, making it feel impossible to abandon the conflict. The more people invest in a conflict, the harder it is to withdraw, even if it's in their interest. Anyone who defects from the turmoil would also have to betray the group. So group conflicts go on and on because of all the cheerleaders and reinforcements. This is part of what makes group conflicts so resilient. If you can't find the offender, you can find his child or his friend, or just someone who lives on the same block. The targets are limitless. The second thing groups do is speed everything up. Groups let us skip steps, causing conflict to escalate much further. To identify friend or foe, group members find shortcuts, even if they have to invent them. In Chicago in the 1980s, the disciples wore Chuck Taylors and scratched out the 5-point star on the shoe, since it looked like the pyramid symbol for the Stones. They wore blue and black, while the Stones wore black and red. The disciples wore their hats and their belt buckles to the right, while the Stones, everyone knew, wore their hats and their belt buckles to the left. Gang members could even identify each other from their posture. Stones crossed their arms right over left, while the disciples went left over right. The Stones wore polos and penny loafers. They were the preppies, the ones whose grandparents had jobs and owned homes with grass yards. The disciples tended to come from low-income housing, or at least that's how Curtis saw it. There was a class divide, albeit a small one. Some disciples were poor, and some Stones were too, but they didn't think they were. Like most group conflicts, there were real differences and imaginary ones. Both kinds of differences kept the conflict going. The truth is, these distinctions were totally arbitrary. Had Curtis lived 5 blocks over, he would have joined the disciples and tipped his hat to the right. This was impossible for him to imagine, so deeply did he feel his allegiance to the Stones and his hatred for the disciples. But like most people entangled in group conflicts, whether religious or political or criminal, his fate was swayed by those twin whims, family and geography. In Northern Ireland, there were 3,600 deaths attributed to the Troubles, as that conflict was known. There, the two sides had to invent ways to tell each other apart, just like the Stones and the Disciples. Protestants largely wanted the union with Great Britain to continue, so they supported the Unionists. Meanwhile, most Catholics supported a united Ireland, separate from Great Britain. They endorsed the Nationalists. But Unionists and Nationalists look superficially identical. They celebrated the same holidays and prayed to the same God, but they were easy prey out in the sunshine, just like our ancestors. So, to tell each other apart, people guessed one another's identity based on their names or their sports jerseys. Protestants were more likely to watch typically English sports like soccer and rugby. Catholics tended to follow Gaelic Irish sports like hurling. Someone named William or Victoria was presumed Protestant. Someone named Seamus or Siobhan was assumed to be Catholic. People also paid obsessive attention to geography. Catholics lived on this block, everyone knew, while Protestants lived on another. The line between real and imaginary differences was fluid. Many said they could tell Catholics or Protestants apart based on the spacing of their eyes, the color of their hair, even how much jewelry they wore. The sorting process came to be known as telling. In Foster Park in the early 1980s, there were 2 blocks where a lot of families affiliated with the gangster disciples lived. That is where Curtis channeled his rage after Benji and Jesse were killed. Those 2 blocks became a battlefield. Even in less violent group conflicts, people engage in telling. Most Democrats are white, middle class, and heterosexual. Most Republicans are white, middle class, and heterosexual too. So what then? Americans now guess each other's partisan leanings based on what they eat, drive, and drink. People who go to Starbucks or Chipotle are assumed to be Democrats. People who frequent Dunkin' Donuts or Chick fil A are presumed Republicans. I would be so real. Every time I read this, I forget that Dunkin' Donuts is like Republican coded because there isn't Dunkin' in California. Like, or there wasn't when I was there. I think it's probably expanded there now, but like, it was not a thing. There was like maybe two locations. And based on these unreliable cues, surveyed Americans say they'd be more or less likely to want to live, work, or hang out with one another. As with gang conflicts and most other feuds, political preferences are more arbitrary than we think. The vast majority of Americans did not choose their political persuasion, they followed the political persuasion of their parents. They are not making rational choices about politics based on years of study of all of their options, no more than they've studied all religions before choosing one or none. It's often a matter of chance, but it doesn't feel that way. It may seem silly to compare Northern Ireland with the United States or gang warfare with political polarization, but something significant happens when groups assign meaning to superficial cues. The enemy is caricatured. It is easier to dismiss and demean a cartoon villain. In conflict, you feel some contempt for a caricature, and in peacetime, you might just avoid discussing politics with them, all of which perpetuates the conflict by preventing us from knowing one another for who we actually are. And if violence were to break out tomorrow between Democrats and Republicans in an American town, cues like coffee cups and sandwich wrappers could become a matter of life or death, like a hat turned to the left. Oh boy. Let me see. I just want to see. I think this chapter is a doozy. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna see if we can finish the chapter. But first, I'm gonna get up and stretch a little bit. Oh. All right. We have stretched. We are hydrating. And we are continuing. Also, like, absolutely feel free to, if you have commentary, feel free to inject commentary into the chat. I know that this also makes really good background noise, and if you're just using it as like an audiobook, that is 100% okay, but do not feel like you cannot say anything on my account. All right. Revenge works. After Benji and Jesse died, Curtis didn't dance much. His identities got reshuffled, leaving less and less space for him to maneuver. He was a stone, most of all, and that blocked out other parts of his personality. It was hard being a tough guy and dancing. They're like opposites. Besides, by the mid 1980s, house music was the new big thing, not popping and locking. This new electronic dance music was created in the underground clubs of Chicago. And the city's most famous house DJs and nightclubs were gay, and Curtis couldn't have anything to do with that. The gang taught Curtis that real men were supposed to be aggressive, with a hair trigger temper. The gang set the bar for what counted as humiliating, and it was breathtakingly low. Never allow disrespect. Oop, never allow disrespect, or else it will never stop. When kids made fun of him for dancing, he stopped popping and locking at Foster Park. Then he stopped dancing anywhere. He got a tattoo of a pyramid, the gang's symbol, on his chest. He let go of whatever didn't fit the gang's definition of a man. In 8th grade, a girl called Curtis gay. When he heard about it, he went looking for her. He found her in her classroom and slapped her across the face, hard, in front of everyone. He got suspended for that, but he hadn't felt like he had a choice. His friends said Curtis had an incredible Hulk switch. He'd be friendly and calm, and then bam, he'd just start inflicting harm on people. Revenge is a way to escape the pain of humiliation. It is rational, at least in the short term. It may lead to more loss eventually, but for a brief period, revenge works. It can rebalance the equation. Rather than marinating in the pointlessness of it all, the slow motion tragedy of life in a neighborhood with 40% unemployment, corrupt politicians, untrustworthy police, and broken schools, Curtis became part of something bigger than himself. He was a stone. Violent conflict gives people a sense of meaning that they don't want to lose. The hotter it gets, the more essential it feels. Fire starters accelerate this process. Conflict entrepreneurs encourage people to find the meaning in conflict, and it's not hard to do. By framing events as humiliating, they detonate the nuclear bomb of emotion. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States, Osama bin Laden released this statement. What America is tasting now is something insignificant compared to what we have tasted for scores of years. Our nation, the Islamic world, has been tasting this humiliation and this degradation for more than 80 years. Its sons are killed, its blood is shed, its sanctuaries are attacked, and no one hears and no one heeds. After the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the bloody suppression of protests in Tiananmen Square, the Chinese government needed to find ways to regain public support, particularly among young people. In 1991, the government launched an education campaign designed to highlight China's collective victimhood at the hands of Japanese and Western imperialists, going back to the mid 1800s. The campaign funded memorial sites and required all teachers, soldiers, and state employees to take regular classes in patriotic education. In 2004, it recommended 300 films, books, and songs designed to boost patriotism, including one book titled Never Forget Our National Humiliation. Conflict entrepreneurs draw on absolutist rhetoric, sweeping language that tends to make people more attached to conflict and less flexible. In a smaller way, this is what Gary's advisor Tanya did in Muir Beach. She described his battle against the old guard in the same grandiose language she uses in her labor organizing work. In my world, Tanya told me over dinner near Muir Beach, there are two sides, and it's a war. She compared the old guard to Trump and the new guard to Obama 3 times in our conversation. She talked about the good people and the bad people in the neighborhood, and she sounded ready to go to war all over again, a full 2 years after Gary had lost power on the board. Part of me feels like we should just run a team and kick him out, she said, just to prove we can. This language sounds like satire, as I write it here. Who would talk this way about a neighborhood election? But in person, Tanya was very compelling. Her conviction was so powerful, so competent, like a force that lit her up from the inside. It was hard to resist. It reminded me of another time someone pulled me close and insisted we were at war. I was a reporter at Time, covering Homeland Security, talking to Michael Chertoff, the then Secretary of Homeland Security. We were speeding through DC in his chauffeur-driven black car, and he was uninterested in answering the questions I wanted to ask him. It was more than 5 years after 9/11, and he seemed worried. He had something he wanted me to know about terrorism. This is a war, he kept telling me, even though I hadn't asked. I had covered 9/11 in Manhattan, where my husband and I were living at the time. I remember the sound of fighter jets arcing across the sky, the sight of thousands of dust-covered Americans walking uptown, away from the rubble, the bitter stench that hung in the air for weeks afterwards. I spent years covering those attacks and others, listening to the stories of victims and survivors. I wrote a book about what they told me. So terrorism was not abstract to me. I understood the stakes. But that day in the black car, when I mentioned that a lot of terrorism experts advised treating terrorists like a criminal network, given how they operate, compared to nation states in times of war, he rejected that language out of hand. Terrorism was nothing like crime, he said. Terrorism was an existential threat. It seemed very important to him, to his department, and maybe to his budget, to frame it that way. This language made a lot more sense coming from Chertoff than from Tanya, admittedly. But I've learned to pause when someone uses the language of war, absent an actual honest to God war, of course. and ask myself that question again. Who does this serve? Grandiose language is one way conflict entrepreneurs manipulate our emotions. It clarifies everything, washing away important details, energizing us to fight, to sacrifice, to ignore the costs. In Paris in 2015, 3 weeks after a series of ISIS attacks had killed more than 100 people, psychologist Daniel Ravenpour and his colleagues asked a large group of Parisians to read an article about the French government's plans to prevent future attacks. One version framed these attacks as calculated and measured. Nope, these actions, not these attacks. One version framed these actions as calculated and measured, while the other described the same countermeasures in loftier language, such as more powerful than expected and total war. The Parisians who read the more dramatic language were more likely to say they found meaning in the conflict compared to the ones who read the more restrained content. They were also more likely to agree to statements like, "Because of the recent acts of terror, I now have a greater sense of purpose in life." The pursuit of revenge can bond us together in our own groups, delivering a sense of exhilaration and mission. Conflict entrepreneurs understand this, and so they talk about conflict like it is a religion unto itself, a way to make sense of the world and our place in it, a sacred flame that must never be extinguished. Revenge can staunch the pain of humiliation, but it exacts a punishing cost. It requires total devotion, the kind that eventually becomes a sort of prison. Wherever he went, Curtis learned to scan the street up and down to see who was coming, which cars were slowing down for no reason. He tried to be the last person to leave a room, so his back was never turned on anyone. He took different routes home from school. Eventually, families with disciple members had to move away from Foster Park. The neighborhood became less forgiving. There were whole blocks where Curtis couldn't go. When he was about 12 years old, he got shot twice, once in the foot and once in the side. And who do you think shot him? It was those disciples, of course. God, the cost of revenge is. I know so many people who have escaped Scientology and are still stuck in it because they need revenge in order to make sense of the trauma they went through. And so they are still fighting this war against Scientology, who, like, to be clear, mostly doesn't pay attention to them. Like, it's almost silly because it's not that I think survivors shouldn't speak out or anything like that. I talk about my experiences with Scientology fairly frequently. Like, I definitely think if people want to talk about it, feel that it's important to talk about it, they should talk about it. But, like, there are people who their whole life is just dedicated to posting videos about how Scientology is an evil cult and, like, going and protesting in front of the Scientology buildings. And there's, like, that doesn't do much. There's also people who run, like, the Aftermath Foundation and help people escape Scientology and, like, kind of just get on with that work, which is different than, like, the obsessed with revenge side. And I don't know, it's sad. Like, it is really sad to me. All right. Murder City. Since the Cold War ended, wars of all kinds have declined dramatically. And the wars that do happen tend to kill fewer people than in the past. Why is this? Partly, humans have gotten better at preventing wars and keeping the peace. We've come to rely more on third parties like the United Nations and other groups to help facilitate peace deals and monitor compliance afterward. These institutions are designed, however imperfectly, to activate our cooperative instincts, not our adversarial ones. Like the Baha'i elections, where no one is allowed to campaign, they have a lot of built in guardrails to prevent high conflict. These institutions often fail. As a species, humans are in our infancy when it comes to creating mutualistic cooperatives like this, and we have a long way to go. But there's no denying that wars and violent death generally have become rarer over time, thankfully. Book was written in 2021. Book was written in 2021. Note to self, 2021. Okay. Today, about 8 of every 10 violent deaths happen outside of recognized conflict zones in places like Chicago. In 2015, more people were killed in Brazil, which was not at war, than in Syria, which was. This kind of grinding violence looks, in many places, like the kind of gang clashes and everyday brutality Curtis encountered growing up in Chicago. In other places, it features paramilitary killings and organized crime. If we've gotten better at preventing wars in some places, we've got a long way to go to contain this kind of chronic non war violence all around the world. For example, why was Chicago so much more violent in 2018 than, say, Los Angeles or New York City? Why was St. Louis, Missouri, located just 300 miles from Chicago, almost 3 times deadlier than Chicago? In 2018, St. Louis had a higher murder rate than Cali, Colombia, Chihuahua, Mexico, or Guatemala City. For centuries, scholars have tried to figure out what predicts endemic violence. Is it a function of poverty or culture? Is it about the competition for resources or the number of rival groups? The existence of groups, ethnic or religious, does not seem to make a country more prone to civil war. There are some very diverse places that are also extraordinarily peaceful. Amsterdam, for example, is home to some 180 different nationalities. 1 in every 2 residents is a first or second generation immigrant. But in 2018, only 14 people were killed in Amsterdam. 14 people. More than 10 times as many people were murdered that year in my home base of Washington, D.C., a slightly smaller city. What about access to guns? Yes, to a degree. It's harder to kill large numbers of people without high powered weaponry. Americans possess almost half the world's civilian owned guns, despite representing less than 5% of the world's population. As you might expect, the United States also has a homicide rate 50% above the average for developed countries. Define developed country. Amanda, what's a developed country? If groups can make it easier for conflict to escalate, guns can make it easier for conflicts to end in murder. But like other complex social problems, violent conflict depends on the interaction of many different things, like a chemical equation. Guns matter, and so do other things. It's the combination that's poisonous. What about a weak police force or government? When governments falter or fail, violence fills the void, and that makes sense. But what causes a state to be weak? It's not simply a matter of a failing economy. For the most part, violent crime does not rise or fall in lockstep with GDP. I have a lot of feelings about this part of the book, but I don't know enough. I don't feel confident enough in what I know in this arena in terms of like statistics and sources to be like, but I think there is a big chunk missing here. Anyway, the most vexing problem, particularly for democracies, seems to be a complicit state, as foreign policy scholar Rachel Kleinfeld found. In Pakistan, for example, the intelligence service has given money and sometimes weaponry to radical Islamist groups to use against various political opponents. The government does this while simultaneously pointing to the threat of radical Islamists to justify its own budget. The corruption metastasizes. Regular people learn that they cannot rely on the government, and so they seek justice in other ways. Violence becomes normalized. Societies become decivilized. Ordinary people become impulsive, quicker to anger, and more ready to see violence as normal, Kleinfeld wrote. At that point, it becomes much harder for governments to restore order. The state creates a monster, and it takes over. In Chicago, the first gangs were white gangs, run out of volunteer fire departments. When professionals took over the firefighting in Chicago, the gangs shifted into neighborhood taverns, where politicians started sponsoring them. In the late 19th century, these politicians created athletic clubs, groups of largely Irish immigrants who intimidated voters and stuffed ballot boxes to ensure their boss's reelection. Over the next 50 years, the gangs enforced racial segregation too. Chicago politicians enacted restrictive racial covenants that prohibited Black people from buying or renting properties in white areas. And whatever the laws could not accomplish, the gangs did. They attacked African Americans who voted against the Democratic machine that dominated Chicago politics, and they deployed violence and fear to make sure Black families stayed out of white neighborhoods. Politicians outsourced the dirty work they wanted done in order to preserve their power. The state was complicit in the violence in Chicago back then, just as it is in Pakistan today. It's not a coincidence that mob boss Al Capone made his career in Chicago, running a multi-million dollar bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling operation there in the 1920s. Around this time, Chicago earned the nickname Murder City, with a homicide rate 24 times the national urban average. Well after political machines had lost their hold over other American cities, Mayor Richard J. Daley continued to rule Chicago like a feudal lord. From 1955 to 1976, Daley controlled some 35,000 patronage jobs, which he used to demand loyalty from Democrats and render Republicans irrelevant. Since Curtis's birth, 3 dozen aldermen have been convicted on corruption charges in Chicago. That's nearly one in every 5 members of the city council over that period. More people have been convicted on federal political corruption charges in Chicago than in any other sizable U.S. city. The stories of kickbacks and bribery schemes follow a sickening rhythm. One of the only American judges ever convicted of fixing murder cases was from Chicago, convicted of fixing 3 murder cases involving gang conflicts. Today, Chicago is not comparable to Pakistan, but the history of government sponsored violence and the continuing tradition of corruption at the state and city level perpetuate the spirals of violence. Much has changed, but not nearly enough. It is impossible to understand the bloodshed in the streets of Chicago today without understanding this understory. Each homicide costs the city of Chicago about $1.5 million, but most killings go unsolved. If you murder a white person in Chicago, you have about a 50% chance of getting away with it. If you murder a Black person, you have a 78% chance of getting away with it, Chicago public radio station WBEZ found in 2019. The police are not trusted, and neither is the city or state government. Illinois ranks last in the nation when it comes to trust in state government. So violent groups step in and exact a kind of justice where there is none. The worst violence in Chicago today is clustered in just a handful of neighborhoods. In these places, groups speed up confrontations and perpetuate blood feuds, making them as dangerous as the most unstable countries in the world. Most of this violence has nothing to do with drug markets. It starts instead with personal beefs that escalate into vendettas, flaring up on social media, and exploding in real life gun battles. One of these neighborhoods is the neighborhood surrounding Foster Park, where Curtis grew up. A lovely surging. Quote, violence helps the individual to escape the irrelevance of his existence, fills the emptiness of his life, and provides him with the heady experience of power over himself and others. Unquote. Allison Jameson, The Heart Attacked, Terrorism and Conflict in the Italian State. Curtis had been close to his mom his whole life. Around the time he became a stone, though, his mother married a new man, a huge man who had a cocaine and heroin habit. So Curtis took up a new hobby, one that fit into his new identity in a way that dancing did not. He got a weight set and put it in the kitchen, getting bigger and stronger day by day. He needed to defend himself and his mom from the monster in her bedroom. Curtis also started playing football, and he was good. His family talked about college and pro ball and who knows what might happen. Football kept him steady, kept him going to practice each day, leaving fewer hours for gangbanging. Curtis was chosen to be salutatorian for his 8th grade graduation, and he tested into a magnet high school for science and technology. There was still more to his life than the gang. But right before the graduation ceremony, a disciple caught him out of his neighborhood with his hat to the left. The disciple beat Curtis with a baseball bat. He woke up in an ambulance. He didn't do the graduation speech because of his concussion. He had trouble getting his graduation cap to fit on his head over the swelling. Then in high school, Curtis was in the back seat of a friend's car when they drove into a light pole. Curtis tore his ACL, and that was the end of his football career. What hurt Curtis the most was the look in his mother's eyes. It was more than just disappointment. It looked, to him at least, like disgust. Her son, the dancer, was no longer dancing. Her son, the football player, was no longer playing football. He had been their ticket, and he'd thrown it away. His football coach had come to the house to give him his highlight reel for a keepsake. If there was a way out for him and his family, he didn't know what it might be. This narrowing is how conflict becomes intractable, leaving less and less space to maneuver. Some days it seemed like all he had left was the conflict with the disciples. That never ended. In March 1989, when he was 17, Curtis found his mother's body in an alley. She'd been stabbed in the heart by his stepdad. After killing her, his stepdad had taken her wallet and used the money to buy drugs. Curtis had not been able to save her. Even though he'd lifted weights, even though he'd found a backup army in his gang, even though he'd warned his mother to take a gun with her that night, he'd failed to prevent the thing he'd feared most. Never mind that he was on crutches at the time, still healing from the car accident. He'd cast himself as her protector, as her closest confidant, and now he'd lost her, his dance partner. He was broken and alone. What Curtis wanted then was to kill the man who did this. He wanted to do it slowly, painfully. He had to find a way to ease the pain he felt. Revenge was the only way to equalize the injustice, according to everything he'd learned as a boy in Chicago and as a Stone. A man could not rely on the authorities to do what must be done, so he called on his brother Stones to help him. Together, they went to the home of his stepdad's family. Still on crutches, his gang members at his side, Curtis banged on the door. No one answered. He kicked the door with his one good leg. Finally, someone answered and insisted his stepdad wasn't there. He didn't believe it. Curtis had brought a Molotov cocktail to throw through the window to light the place up. That would send everyone running. He went to the car to get it. He'd used a wild Irish rose wine bottle, but before he could throw it, one of the Stones stopped him. We came for him, not for the family, his friend said, and Curtis backed down. It was a fleeting example of the second paradox of high conflict. Just as groups can incite violence, they can suppress it. 4 days later, Curtis's stepdad was arrested. He was charged with first-degree murder and sentenced to 39 years in prison. But no counselor showed up at Curtis's door. He had his grandmother, but she was overwhelmed with raising his little siblings and with her own grief. Most of these days, his family was just the Stones. Violence came more easily after that. Each time Curtis pulled the trigger, he literally saw his stepdad's face. It made hurting people satisfying. The conflict with the disciples became a war by proxy, or what psychologists call displacement. He couldn't take a gun to the broken institutions of Chicago. He couldn't kill his stepdad, nor the boy who shot Benji, his basketball hero. None of the actual causes of his suffering were in his sight. This did not stop him from fighting, however. Instead, it propelled him. There is a sense of being in anger, Toni Morrison wrote in The Bluest Eye. A reality and presence, an awareness of worth. It is a lovely surging. Having power over someone, even the wrong someone, still feels like something. That October, the feds raided the gang's temple in the middle of Friday prayers. Over 50 federal agents surrounded the place, breaking down the doors with sledgehammers and blowtorches. They rounded up much of the gang's upper hierarchy, indicting 65 of the members on racketeering, murder, kidnapping, firearm, drug, and other charges. By then, Jeff Fort, the founder of the Stones, was himself locked up, having been convicted on elaborate domestic terrorism charges. All these arrests created a leadership vacuum, and so Curtis rose through the ranks, skipping entire rungs of the ladder, becoming a leader at a time when he himself desperately needed to be led. Curtis became the muscle for his family, too. He wasn't going to let his younger siblings or any of his relatives die the way his mother had died. His family members learned to call him whenever they had a problem, and he'd send a battalion. What was crazy was being young and starting to have adults being afraid of you, Curtis said. Being able to have some power when you are feeling powerless. One day, he went to visit his girlfriend at her job at McDonald's. He walked in and scanned the place like he always did, looking for threats. The guy working the fryer had his hat to the right. Curtis took one look at him and went to the manager. That guy had to go, he said. He couldn't have a disciple working there right next to his girl. No way. When he came back later, the disciple was still there with his hat to the right. Curtis couldn't believe it. That hat felt like a taunt right in his face. So what else could he do? Curtis and his friend vaulted over the counter and started beating on the manager. It was a rush, seeing a grown man cowering before them. One day, his grandmother came home from a community policing meeting and started crying. The whole meeting was about you, she told Curtis. You and your friends are destroying the community. He would never forget that moment watching his grandmother, one of the strongest people he knew, weeping. You're my grandson, but they're talking about you like you're an animal. There were days when it felt like the Hulk was taking over, and he could barely remember that back-flipping boy he used to be. It was scary sometimes what came over him. That's why Curtis didn't drink or do drugs. He didn't want to feel more out of control than he already did. 1 month after his mother's death, Curtis and other gang members beat a man with a broken bottle. They hurt him so badly that the guy ended up paralyzed. Not long afterward, Curtis was shot again. This time in the head. He'd been in a dispute with a vice lord, but he and the guy settled it with a conversation on the street. Seconds later, another vice lord shot Curtis, not knowing the conflict had ended. Groups contain multitudes. Curtis lay on his porch, unable to speak, and heard a police officer say they could write him off. It was a miracle he didn't die right then. He graduated somehow, but 3 months after he turned 19, he was arrested 4 blocks from Foster Park carrying a loaded Smith & Wesson .357 caliber revolver. A woman had called the police, claiming Curtis had come to her house and threatened to kill her relative. Curtis pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Because of his gang influence, he was sent to Stateville Correctional Center, a maximum security prison. Maybe, he thought, he'd find Benji's killer in prison. Or his stepdad. That was something to hope for. Hypnotized. You might be reading this and thinking, I'm not part of a gang or a blood feud. Not yet, anyway. What does this have to do with political polarization or the fight I had with my brother last year at Christmas? Curtis's story is an extreme case, but it's through the extremes that we can see the contours of the commonplace more easily. We don't all live in a world in which violence is normalized and encouraged, luckily for us. But many of us know what it feels like to be stuck in some kind of tar pit, in a dispute that takes more than it gives. It might be a conflict with a spouse or a coworker or someone you don't even know. But the feeling is similar. You might have imaginary conversations with this person. Whenever your anger fades, you catch yourself actively reviving the feeling, inexplicably stoking the fire, reminding yourself of all the reasons you have to feel wronged, and maybe even discovering new ones. Groups do this for you. As soon as you get distracted by some other part of your life, groups remind you of the conflict. Other group members continuously catalog all the wrongs you've experienced, never letting the fire go out. It happens on talk radio and on Twitter. The group immortalizes the conflict like an eternal flame, never untended. It also happens in prison, of course. When he got there, Curtis did not find Benji's killer or his stepdad, but he did find the ideology that kept his group going. In prison, he learned what the Stones were really about. One of Jeff Fort's brothers was in the same facility, along with other high-ranking gang leaders. There was a command structure, a way of doing things right. It was a kind of respect I'd never seen before. Everyone prayed at a certain time. Islam was a way of life, not just talk. If you got an order to do something, you did it, no questions asked. It was like the Godfather in there, and Curtis was impressed. He read and memorized the Stones' constitution, bylaws, and pledge. He spent hours talking to the older Stone generals, listening to their stories. He was capable of great discipline and dedication, and so were these Stones. Anything I've ever been part of, he said, I always go deep. A big laugh. The Stones were outnumbered by the disciples in prison, but it seemed like they never lost a fight. Whatever they lacked in manpower, they made up for in organization and devotion. It was something to see. So now Curtis found a spiritual scaffolding to go with his gang identity, a way to manage his pain that was bigger than petty feuds at McDonald's. He was like a soldier discovering an elite unit of the special forces. There was something more out there, and he became part of it. To this day, Curtis can recite the Stones' creed from memory without pausing to think. Out of the darkness into the light, Blackstone gave us courage, Blackstone give us light. Blackstone give us something that no man should be deprived of, a happiness called stone love. Ideology is not as important to group conflict as emotion, but ideology matters. It can justify violence, just like grandiose language, providing a deeper sense of purpose than the conflict might have without it. Ideology can make people feel they are part of something bigger. In 1993, Curtis left prison with more responsibility and conviction than he'd had going in. By then, Chicago had changed too. Crack had finally made its way into the neighborhoods, and there were huge sums of money to be made. The city's homicide rate peaked soon afterward, due in part to the spike in violence between the Stones and the Disciples. It was bodies dropping all over the place, Curtis said. He started traveling around Chicago with security, armed men who formed a perimeter around him wherever he went, just like Jeff Fort, the Stones' founder, who was by then in prison for life. Curtis made money, more money than he'd ever seen. He bought cars, he started a strip club. He knew these things were in direct conflict with Islam and the values the Stones had claimed to endorse, but he did it anyway. He still went to Friday prayers, didn't he? It's easy to ignore hypocrisy when you have an enemy. A year later, at age 22, Curtis was again charged with possessing a gun. He was sentenced to prison for 3.5 years. After he got out, he got arrested again, this time for possessing cocaine. He ended up getting lucky and the charge got dropped. But in jail, he had enough time and space to ask himself, how did the police know where I would be on that day? Only his brother Stones could have known. He wondered, not for the last time, if their loyalties were to the Stones or to the dollar. It was getting hard to tell. And that is the end of part one. Part one is all about high conflict and how we get into it and what it is. Part one, into conflict. Part two, out of conflict. So we are almost halfway through the book, probably actually a little more than halfway because there's like appendixes and stuff. So we're about halfway through. I know it's a lot to sit with. Um, and so next time we're going to start talking about, okay, everybody's in conflict. Curtis is in conflict. Gare Bear's in conflict. We're all fucking in conflict. How do we get out of it? And the good news is that there's like half the book left. So there's a lot of ways to get out of it. And I fucking love this book. I love, 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 love this book. Even though I don't see eye to eye with her about everything, I think she has a lot of really good points. Um, all right. That is it for today's stream. Thank you so much for joining for book club. As always, I will throw this up on my YouTube, which should be linked on my profile somewhere. But if you want to go back and rewatch or re-listen to episodes that you missed or parts of episodes that you missed or whatever, they're all archived on my YouTube. So even when Twitch deletes the stored streams, you can still find them there. And now we're gonna raid a crocheter.